So, how much was your mother's inheritance? I was taken aback by Bob's comment. The funeral for my mother had just ended. Without a single word of comfort, he said this to me, clearly feeling down. Maybe he thought about the inheritance because I was looking at a document, but that's just unthinkable. It was about $1 million. $1 million? That's it? But, well, after taxes and all, it's still a couple $100,000, huh? Hearing my reluctant answer, Bob muttered to himself and smirked. What a creepy smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things won't go his way. However, the next day, Bob quickly put his plans into action. But his naive idea would probably take everything away from him. He hadn't realized that yet. My name is Catherine O'Malley. I got married through a matchmaker when I was 20. My husband's name is Bob. He's 5 years older than me, a company employee, and the eldest son of the O'Malley family. However, even though he's the eldest, his younger brother, Mike, had left home after college and cut ties with the family. Because of this, Bob was treated like an only son and was very cherished by his parents. To be honest, I didn't really want to marry Bob. But my family has been running a business for generations. Being in a position often referred to as a rich girl, I couldn't go against my parents' decision. And though I ended up marrying Bob, he probably couldn't refuse either, since his dad also ran a business. It wasn't a marriage based on mutual feelings. It was far from a happy married life. To make things worse, we couldn't have children. Since we married young, it was hard to give up on having kids. I thought if we had a child, things might get better. But despite medical treatment, it didn't happen. Hey, Baron. Did you finish the cleaning? At first, my in-laws, who once cherished me as their family, stared, calling me Baron after a few years. You wouldn't need to go to the doctor if you did things right. What a waste of money. My father-in-law would make sarcastic remarks every day. And even though he knew about it, Bob never stood up for me. He'd just lay there reading the newspaper or taking a nap, snoring loudly. When I said I wanted to start working for a change of pace, he was like, people would think we're struggling if you went to work. True, back then, it was common for women to become housewives after marriage. But living alone with my mother-in-law was honestly a daily nightmare. Nobody would help. I couldn't talk to my parents because I didn't want to worry them, and I couldn't leave because it was a marriage of convenience. But I believed I'd be rewarded for enduring all this one day. However, things never got better. 20 years after our marriage, when I turned 40, my father-in-law passed away in an accident. It came to light that his company had been evading taxes. All assets were seized to cover back taxes and fines, and the company went bankrupt. The substantial life insurance on my father-in-law was also used for this. We managed to keep the house, but our comfortable life was over. At 45, I thought it might be tough for Bob to find a new job, but my parents introduced him to one. Thanks to that, he found work quickly, but my mother-in-law aged drastically and seemed like a mere shell of her former self. For a while, she didn't even have the energy to make snide remarks at me, which was a relief. But then, she suffered a stroke and needed care. This situation made it impossible for me to even think about trying to have a baby. I was already 40. Deep down, I had kind of given up, but this was the real turning point. Bob naturally expected me to take care of his mother, and on his days off, he just lounged around the house as he used to. Bob, could you help with your mom's care once in a while? One day, I mustered the courage to tell him. Even if it's just on weekends or helping with a meal, it'd be a huge relief to me. But Bob frowned at my words. Excuse me? I'm working, you know. Can't I get a break on my days off? I didn't think he got it. That I didn't even have a day off. With his father's business gone under and my parents concerned for me, they finally said me to come back. But what would become of my mother-in-law if I did? We currently have a caregiver come once a week, but I doubt we can afford a daily caregiver. Even though she asked me to work harder and made snide comments, I couldn't abandon her. Bob stared to leave the house earlier even on his days off. He said he felt my disapproving gaze whenever he tried to relax at home. My wife doesn't let me relax even on my days off. I heard the rumor that he stared telling our neighbors. And he began taking solo trips to places in countryside. Our neighbors know about his mother's condition. Yet Bob, knowing that, would openly comment on dumping the caregiving on me. He probably doesn't realize how he comes off. I've felt bad for his mother, who he once adored but now avoids since she fell ill. Because of you, Bob doesn't come to see me. She'd say that from time to time. Should I leave then? When I retort that, she'd instantly fall silent. I continued this life for another 20 years, with the long caregiving journey finally ending when my mother-in-law passed, joining her husband. I was approaching 60. I no longer had feelings for Bob, but I had come to terms with many things. At this point, I couldn't just leave, and I guess I'll live out my days in this house. Bob, at least, was diligent in his job. That dedication was recognized, and even after retirement, he received requests to work as senior staff. Thanks to that, I'm able to live as I do now. While we were never close as a couple, I'm grateful for that. Our relationship wasn't great, but Bob never tried to kick me out. He probably thinks it's too late now. He still doesn't want to be home on weekends and goes out, so I get to enjoy my alone time. Recently, I even took up pottery. I made some friends at this age, and for the first time since marriage, I've been enjoying my life. But Bob seems irked by it. He was like, while I'm out working, you're just goofing off, and one day, he burnt the bag I used for my pottery class in the backyard. What the hell are you doing? Stop being so obsessed with that weird hobby and do some house chores. Inside the bag were pottery materials and my personal items. Even with water, it was too late, everything was charred. Certainly, anger welled up within me. I thought it might be too late, but the road ahead was long. The word divorce even crossed my mind. But just as I was contemplating that, another misfortune struck me. It was the sudden departure of my parents. My real father passed away unexpectedly from an illness, and just a month after his funeral, my mother too fell ill and followed him. It all happened so suddenly, and I was drowned in sorrow. My father's company was already taken over by my brother, Jake. Given the sheer number of mourners at both my father's and mother's funerals and the busy schedule, I ended up staying in bed for about a week after my mother's funeral. It must have been mental exhaustion. My pottery class friends were considerate enough to check in on me, but only Bob sneered. He was like, "How long are you gonna stay in bed?" I was shocked and tired after Mom's funeral too, but I didn't sleep that much. Must be nice for someone without a job to just sleep. It might be a valid point, but it's the worst thing a husband could say to his wife. The very next day, I forced my weary body up and resumed my usual daily routine. I wasn't really in the mood for hobbies, so I did the bare minimum. Bob, always indifferent to my feelings, seemed satisfied with that. Then, a little while after my mother's funeral, I remembered that the payment deadline to the funeral home was approaching and I looked at a document. Jake was busy with work, so I promised to handle the transfer for him. But Bob, not knowing this, saw me with the document, smirked, and said, "So, how much did you get from your mother's inheritance?" Those words took me aback. He said that without showing an ounce of concern since my mother's funeral. He probably thought about the inheritance because I was looking at the document, but that's just not acceptable behavior. In my listlessness, I replied, "About $1 million. $1 million? That's it? But after taxes and all, you'd still have a few $100,000. Bob muttered and grinned smugly. What a sickening smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things aren't gonna go his way. Without saying anything to Bob, I quietly put away the document. Seeing my silence, even Bob seemed to sense the mood. "Well, you've had a tough time. "You should go to bed early tonight." Coming from him, it felt less than comforting. I wasn't happy to hear it at all. In fact, it left a bad taste in my mouth. Not because Bob said so, but I just didn't want to see his face anymore, so I went to bed early. However, something happened the next day. After breakfast, as usual, Bob left for work. Then I got a call saying he hadn't shown up. I was taken by surprise. This had never happened before. I feared he might have been in an accident and quickly called him. But there was no answer. I was restless, but when I walked into the living room, it all became clear. There was a contact number on the living room table. It was a contact of a lawyer who assists divorce. Seeing that, I instinctively checked where I had kept the documents. As I suspected, they were gone. Unbelievable. I muttered to myself. It wasn't an accident or an incident. Bob probably chose to disappear on his own. I remembered hearing some rustling in the living room that morning. Having stolen those items, Bob probably intended to start a new life, leaving me behind. The only reason he hadn't kicked me out all this while wasn't because he thought it was too late or anything, but because he was eyeing my parents' inheritance. The fact he stole something was undeniable proof. Even so, I remained calm. Actually, there was no need to panic. I took the lawyer's contact and decided to contact it. Bob had only himself to blame. I thought I'd make sure he learned that it's too late for regrets. I made sure to contact Bob's workplace. I haven't been able to reach him either, but it doesn't seem like an accident. I'll inform him to call back as soon as possible. I apologize for the inconvenience. I apologized like that. His colleagues kindly told me they'd consider him on paid leave for the day. I envied Bob for having such a supportive workplace. It was originally a company my parents had introduced him to. I'd like him to be honest with his job, but soon he'll be a stranger to me. After that, I successfully contacted the lawyer and asked the process. After enduring for so long, who knew I could be free so easily? I often think, if I had divorced earlier, maybe my life would have been different. It was when I went back home and was packing my belongings. My cell phone rang. It was from Bob, who hadn't answered any of my previous calls. I knew what he would say. Ignoring the call, I continued packing. However, he kept calling repeatedly. Finally, even the home landline started ringing. I assumed it was probably Bob, and because it was so annoying, I reluctantly answered. "Hello?" Casually saying so, I heard an anxious voice from the other side calling my name. "Yeah, I called you. They said you didn't show up for work. Call your workplace now." "That's not the point right now." But Bob didn't really listen to me. Interrupting my words, he exclaimed, "I thought the document was a check from your mother, but it was not." I couldn't help but laugh upon hearing that. Finally realized, I can't help but think that way. He probably didn't notice because he took it in a hurry. "Well, you've taken an invoice, not a check. And you burned a check from my mother that she gave me before she's gone. I was going to go through a process of cashing it and deposit to our account." "What? Oh, don't you remember? It was in the bag for pottery class." I replied, chuckling. Bob seemed flustered. "Then, what's this for?" "That's the invoice from funeral home. You can clear that if you want. And remember, we still need to go through the probate process for your mother's account." After his mother passed away, I repeatedly asked Bob to do the necessary procedures. I tried going to the bank for the procedures, but they told me Bob may need to involve the probate process and I was too busy to confirm it. So the account was left untouched with just a few dollars in it. About the invoice, I was about to pay and I kept it safe. You gotta be kidding. You should properly manage things from someone who's gone. You were the one who said you'd take care of your mother's later. Don't blame others. So what am I supposed to do now? Well, nothing can be done with my mother's check unless I go to the bank for the procedures. We need to clear the invoice. And you need to check your mother's account. Bob grumbled in response to my words. But I didn't feel like replying and remained silent. Impatient, Bob seemed to have returned to the counter and appeared to be explaining the situation to the bank clerk. Seems like I accidentally burned a check. Can we somehow process this on her behalf? Look, I'm on the phone with my wife right now. It sounded like he was on speaker because I could hear the puzzled voice of the clerk too. I questioned what he was saying. Bob, what are you talking about? There's no way they'd let a stranger do that. What? And I've got in touch with the lawyer to process our divorce earlier. Thanks for getting them ready. Bye now. I said what I needed to and hung up. I'm sure the clerk heard my voice too. I wonder if Bob is pale or blushing right now. Just imagining it made me laugh. Well, I should leave the house before he gets back. Thinking this, I quickly packed my things. And then, I left the house. I headed for my childhood home, which had been vacant since my parents passed away. Turns out, I had inherited that house too. My mother, who ran a business, had assets worth up to $13 million. But inheriting a lot of cash wouldn't do me any good with no kids, and it would not end well if Bob found out. So, I inherited just $1 million to ensure I wouldn't struggle for living expenses and got the family heirlooms, such as my mother's preserved dresses and my father's antiques, which would fetch a pretty penny if appraised. Of course, I had the permission of my brother, Jake. Jake had moved out after his marriage, and he was worried about the house being vacant since he had kids and had taken over the family business. He even said he was glad that he only inherited cash. That's how we had peacefully settled our inheritance. After arriving at my childhood home, I informed Jake about divorcing Bob and moving into our old house. If Catherine is going to live in our old house, I'll be relieved it won't be vacant. But are you really divorcing Bob? Are you sure about this? Yes. We don't have kids and both our parents are gone. If both of us want a divorce, it's for the best. I want to start my life over, and I have no regrets. Jake was concerned about me being alone, but being by myself is better than living as Bob's servant. Besides, if I can spend the last part of my life in the house where I grew up with my family, I'd be happy even if I'm alone. Bob kept calling me many times after that. But he seemed so disoriented that he didn't think I'd be at my childhood home, so he never came. I spent that day by myself. Although the house without family did feel lonely, I felt truly relieved deep down. The next day, I dragged myself out to solve the issues. The invoice was with Bob. It was a bit of a hassle to go get it, but I decided to retrieve it at 6 a.m. when he'd likely be asleep. When I got home, I was hit by the smell of alcohol as soon as I opened the door. It was so strong that I involuntarily wrinkled my nose. Entering the living room, beer cans were strewn everywhere. On top of that, the invoice was torn up and left on the table. That's terrible. No matter how angry he was, he had no right to tear up someone's invoice, and it was for my mother's funeral home. I picked up the pieces and put them in my bag. I also grabbed some clothes and returned to my childhood home. Then, I headed to the bank. But I was stopped at the entrance. Catherine. Bob. To my surprise, Bob was lying in wait for me. I noticed the invoice was missing, so I figured you'd show up. Whether I come here or not, it's none of your business. Come on, we've been together for so many years. Even though we decided to get divorced, he had the audacity to say that. I ignored him and went into the bank. Even then, Bob continued to try to win my favor. But I staunchly ignored him. Then, it happened. Bob, is that you? And Catherine? A voice called out to us. Mike, what are you doing here? It was Bob's younger brother, Mike. Both Bob and I were taken aback by this unexpected encounter. We mostly avoided Mike, seeing him only at funerals. I had been married to Bob for about 40 years, and this was probably only the third time I had seen Mike. It seemed he wanted to cut ties, but their parents had appealed to him emotionally, saying if people found out they'd been disowned by their son, it would be the end of their business. So he'd been asked to at least attend weddings and funerals. We had just met him a few years ago at their mother's funeral, so he probably recognized us from that. Yeah, I came for Mom's inheritance. I was checking the balance and was planning to get in touch with both of you. Mom's? Bob's eyes lit up. I was also shocked. I thought it was just a few $100s left in the account, but according to Mike, there were also some old investments and a safety deposit box that their dad had rented. Mike had once heard about this from their mother. Before she passed away, she had reached out to him and was like, if anything happens, you handle it. But he'd been so busy that he only got around to it now. The thing is, Mike said, looking apologetically at Bob and me. What? Yeah. In the safety deposit box, along with some jewelry, there was a letter. Mom said she would leave all her assets to Catherine. What? I was in complete disbelief. But Bob looked even more shocked. Mike took out a letter from a folder he had. The envelope looked familiar. That's because I had bought it for their mother upon her request. Clearly written in shaky handwriting was, I leave the jewels from the safety deposit box and all other assets to Catherine. I could vividly remember their mother trying hard to write the letter. Do you need the letter? Should I bring it out? When I had asked. It's none of your business. She had coldly replied. Perhaps she had been referring to this. I instinctively covered my mouth. Catherine, you took care of Mom all by yourself, right? She wrote how sorry she was for treating you badly. She probably thought if she told Bob, he'd try to cover it up, and so she told me to handle it instead. Bob, sitting next to me, turned beet red and began shaking. Well, I never really intended to inherit anything. But since I'm a legal heir, I thought I should handle the paperwork. It's just gonna be transferred to Catherine's name, so no big deal, right? Mike said casually. He probably didn't know we were divorced. Shortly after, I was called to the counter. Bob, however, seemed to have lost the energy to follow. Despite not having any real business, he just sat in the lobby. That day, I managed to wire money to the funeral home and other necessary procedures. Guess I'll be heading out first. Take care, Catherine. I'll contact you again. Leaving Bob, who stood beside him in shock, I safely returned to my childhood home. I got another formal message from Mike. It seemed Bob was like, that letter doesn't count. But Mike had persuaded Bob to understand the situation. However, Bob, not convinced, apparently went for a free lawyer consultation. Although my mother-in-law's letter wasn't accept Bob as a formal will, considering legal fees, he was advised it's better to settle things through discussion. Eventually, Bob agreed to inherit the house. The investments weren't that big, and he reluctantly gave up on jewelry and such. Then, I officially received my mother-in-law's inheritance. If Catherine gets my mom's inheritance, shouldn't I get a part of them and my mother-in-law's? That's how Bob challenged the lawyer. They told him it's a different matter. It was downright embarrassing. Despite being calmed down by the lawyer, Bob, still not satisfied, found out I was at my childhood home and came to our place. I was wrong. Let's start over. Realizing he wouldn't get anything, he apologized at the doorstep, wishing for our remarriage. There's no start over. There wasn't any love between us from the beginning. What's there to redo? For the first time, I conveyed my long-held feelings to Bob. Even Bob was at a loss for words. It seemed like he was finally regretting, and I couldn't help but smirk. At least you got the house, right? Oh, did you inform your workplace? If you're that desperate for money, work seriously. Make sure you don't lose your job. I just told him that and closed the door. It's finally over. I have what was left behind by both mothers in my heart. With that, I believe I can live without any constraints in the future. In the end, Bob never informed his workplace, continued his unauthorized absence, and got fired. I had warned him. Losing even his passion for work, which was his only redeeming quality, I wonder what's left for him. Thinking about it, maybe he was diligent in his work not out of responsibility, but to maintain his dignity. Now, with no one to show off his pride to, and no easy money he hoped for, it wouldn't be surprising if he lost his will to live. He was my companion for many years. I'm concerned, but that's it. I'm not going to help him out. I truly apologize for causing you trouble, Catherine. Only Mike apologized to me, knowing everything. He also told me that I wouldn't have to deal with Bob anymore. He probably noticed the dysfunctionality of that family early on, left home when he was young, and now he's likely living happily without involving his family in that mess. It seems Bob has become a recluse, but he's already at the age of getting his pension. He'll probably get by. If he was ready to say, "Let's start over" to me, he should try to start over by himself. After that, I started attending pottery classes again. My friends were happy about my return. I never imagined that days where I can use time just for myself would be so joyful. I also met a wonderful person at the pottery class. I'm done with marriages, but I'm beginning to think that being with someone who loves me might be happier than being alone. It might feel too late, but just like when I got divorced, it's never too late as long as you're alive. Anyone, no matter the age, can be happy. That's what I believe.